You're listening to Live from Lord North Street, a podcast from the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Madeline Grant, editorial manager at the IEA. Today I'm joined by our head of political economy, Dr. Kristian Niemietz, the author of a recent paper which ventures into the realm of fiction to examine the fundamental flaws of socialism. Kristian and I discuss the popular meme that socialism is a great idea in theory, but only fails due to bad implementation or corrupt officials, which is still advocated by trendy millennial socialists today. Kristian debunks this idea and explores how it has been extremely influential in art, culture and fiction over the last century. We look at why this narrative has proven so compelling and whether perhaps free marketeers need to do more to make the moral and philosophical case for capitalism, as well as arguing on raw economic grounds. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe to our podcast channel, IEA Conversations. Kristian, can you first start by outlining what you mean by the kind of socialism, good idea, badly done meme?
Yes, that's the idea that the only reason why socialism always turned authoritarian and technocratic in practice was that was deliberate. That you had people in charge who either were control freaks, who believed that socialism had to be done in that way, or people who abused socialism for their own opportunistic reasons. But either way, the idea is that it could also be done in a completely different way, and that there are no major lessons for socialists to learn from the fact that previous socialist experiments have turned out that way. Because if it is deliberate, then, yeah, of course, there's nothing to learn from that. If somebody accidentally drives a car over a cliff, then you might want to know what that person did wrong, how they lost control over the car, so that you don't make the same mistake. But if they deliberately do it, then there is nothing to learn other than don't drive over a cliff.
So it's kind of the idea that the idea itself is pure and perfect, and it's almost too good for the flawed people that were attempting to implement the system. The saboteurs, the speculators, the people who, basically derailed this brilliant utopia.
Well, yeah, there is also the idea that it just so happened that a lot of the people who got into positions of power in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and later in Maoist China believed in a socialism of an authoritarian kind, but that there is also this completely different tradition of liberal or even libertarian socialism. That is completely untrue. It's not true that previous socialist revolutionaries came to power with the intention of building a technocratic, totalitarian system. It's just that they found out, they learned the hard way, that that is the only way you can make socialism work.
Yeah. How can it end any other way, you might argue? That these are inevitable results of a system that centralises power to such a great extent.
Yeah, the idea has always been that ideally in a socialist system you would not centralize power, you would have the opposite, you would have grassroots power. It's just that organizing economic activity in a democratic way works only in small groups. It's not scalable. You can have an Israeli kibbutz, a small agrarian commune. They can run their affairs in a democratic way because their economy, such as it is very simple, and it's a group of people where everyone knows everyone. It's like a very small village. You can do it on that scale, but as soon as you move to a more complex economy and a larger, more anonymous society, those mechanisms don't work anymore. And then ultimately, yes, you have to specialize. You have to have somebody who is able to make decisions and give orders, and then those people also need a way to enforce those decisions, enforce their plans. There's no point having an economic plan if you can't enforce it, and that is one of the reasons why socialism does turn authoritarian.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember having this argument at university with some of my more communisty, flat-out communist friends that I had at university when people still believe things like that. The examples they would give were invariably, of where socialism had worked, were invariably these small-scale examples, such as the Israeli kibbutz or even something like the Paris Commune in the 19th century. I think another thing that's often overlooked in these situations is that for the kibbutz, for example, involves a small group of people who all share exactly the same goals and aspirations, choosing to participate in a shared endeavour.
Yes.
A socialist system, if we were talking about a country of millions of people, to function properly would have to require, I think, a complete enthusiasm of every single one of those millions of people. And as we're seeing in, how Brexit, for example, is dividing our nation as we speak, can you imagine something that's far more divisive than extrapolating ourselves from an economic and political bloc then imposing a kind of centralised form of government or, you know, a complete sharing of all resources onto a large Western country.
Yeah, exactly. I don't see how anyone can spend 10 minutes on social media and come away with the idea that you could have this harmonious society where everybody works towards the same goals. It frankly isn't like that. And we disagree on a lot of things, and often fiercely so. And that, quite apart from the economics, from economic efficiency arguments, that for me is a reason not to politicize so many areas of life, not to make collective decisions where collective decisions are not needed. The kibbutzim work because they are self-selecting. If you're in a kibbutz and you don't like it, you move away. You have to be the type of person who is prepared to sacrifice a lot of individuality, be a very communal, community-oriented person. Otherwise, it would be hell to live there.
There was a kind of quite baffling exchange I saw on Twitter recently. It's always on Twitter, isn't it? I think it was Aaron Bastani said that central planning worked for Britain during the Second World War, basically won us the war, therefore it's a practicable system even to this day. Which is, you know, that's kind of the old Clement Attlee idea that and the reason that we had rationing until the 50s, this kind of thing. That's actually rather playing into the argument that you've made, Kristian, because there's an example of a time where a country is completely united in a common goal, and where that kind of level of central planning, even if it is anathema to personal freedoms, people will be willing to sacrifice them knowing that we're in an emergency state of affairs.
Yeah, that's why that example that he brought up was so inappropriate, because even Hayek, who was probably who wrote more about the dangers of central planning than anyone else who ever lived, even he admitted that, yes, a time of national emergency, and of course he did a lot of his writing during the Second World War, said yes, in those situations it is appropriate, because there it really is true that the whole nation has only one goal, and that is to fight off an invader. And even then, it's not just any war. The Iraq war was not something that united the country very much. It has to be an existential threat, an enemy that could potentially annihilate you, where everything else, every disagreement that you might have with your neighbor really comes in second place, and there is this overriding aim that dominates everything else.
Yeah.
In those situations, yes, central planning can work.
Yeah.
For a limited period.
Yeah, but it's a real anomaly. So what you describe as the good idea, badly done meme, it's clearly very compelling in popular culture and public discourse even today. And you've written about how it seems to abound in film, literature, art, culture. And in fact, you've written your own offering into this kind of this particular genre of literature in a paper that you did recently for the IEA, where you talk about an imagined universe in which German reunification had never taken place. Firstly, could you give me some examples of where we see this meme emerging? And also, let's have a think about why it is so, you know, very compelling.
The most famous example is of course Animal Farm, George Orwell, and to a lesser extent 1984. Especially in Animal Farm, you have the idea that the revolution itself is noble, but it then gets corrupted and derailed. So that's very much compatible with a Trotskyite interpretation of the Russian Revolution. It was a noble endeavor, but it got hijacked by the wrong people. You could quite easily imagine a version of Animal Farm with the happy ending. You would have to remove Napoleon, the bad pig, or you would have
Snowball. Is it the Trotsky one?
Snowball is Trotsky. Yes,
yeah.
You could have him in charge, or you could have the wise old Boer, old Major, who represents Karl Marx. Could have him living for longer and providing some spiritual guidance. You could do some relatively minor tweaks, and the revolution working in that way. I don't know whether that's what Orwell wanted to say, that it could have worked with a few minor alterations, but it is certainly compatible easily with that reading. It is a revolution that is not doomed right from the start. And that's because there is no economic critique in it. There is no connection between the fact that this farm is supposed to represent a socialist economy and the fact that the pigs take over as a new ruling class. You could write a very similar novel about some completely different system, or about a single organization that starts with a noble goal and then bad people take over. It doesn't have to be socialism. But Orwell would have had a hard time writing a sequel. Imagine Orwell had lived for longer than he did, and somebody would have asked him, let's say 20 years later, saying, you described how, in your interpretation, the Soviet Revolution the Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution went wrong. Now, tell us, can you write Animal Farm Part 2, explaining why all those other socialist experiments in China and the rest of the Eastern Bloc and in North Vietnam, in Cuba, why there were so many others, and all of them turned out in a similar way, then you would have a hard time. You would have to have 24 farms where due to some strange coincidence, it's always the pigs or maybe some other groups of animals becoming a ruling class and taking over. And you would at some point have to ask, why don't they eventually realize this, that they have to keep an eye on the pigs? There has to be something else going on.
What are some other examples that, because I think Animal Farm it's been widely read. I remember reading it as a child, and I didn't actually understand that it was an allegory, and I just thought it was a fairly tedious book about farmyard animals. But what are some other more contemporary examples?
There's the movie Goodbye Lenin, which is from, I think, 15 years ago, which is not meant to be a political movie, so I don't want to read too much into it. But what happens there is that there's this family in East Berlin where the mother falls into a coma just a few days before the fall of the Berlin Wall and wakes up again just before reunification. So she misses out all the events. She knows nothing about what happened. And the doctors tell her adult children, they say, your mother is still very weak. Make sure that nothing upsets her, because that would trigger another fatal attack. So they decide not to tell her about what happened in the meantime. They pretend that the GDR still exists and that nothing has changed, because she is a member of the Socialist Party, and therefore they think learning about the demise of the GDR would upset her a lot. So they decorate the flat in the way it was then, and they dress in the same way and try to hide everything from her. They even imitate the GDR's news broadcast, which of course doesn't exist anymore, but they film it themselves. They develop this elaborate scheme to pretend that a state which is just disappearing is still there. What happens then is that the son, Alex, who is the main character actually of the movie, in his news broadcast, he doesn't just reanimate the GDR as it actually was, he changes it. He turns it into a different country. He turns it into the sort of country that he would have wanted the GDR to be. This ends with some fictional new general secretary of the party taking over, who is a nice guy, an idealist, and who says, you know what, we've gone wrong. We've imposed this authoritarian Soviet type of socialism, but that's not what our ideals are about. We'll do it completely differently now. We will open the wall. And it becomes a completely different country despite some fairly minor tweaks. In this version of events, the leaders of the GDR are not bad people. They are just... They're a bit like Ebenezer Scrooge, who is actually deep down a nice guy. He just needs a bit of soul searching. So it is as if you had these three ghosts, maybe the ghost of Marx, Engels and Trotsky, visiting them overnight, and they wake up one morning saying, we'll be completely different from now on. And that's all that is required.
Yeah. I've seen that film too, and the mother strikes me, if I remember rightly, she's a kind of loyal party hand who really believes in the message. And she's almost akin to a kind of boxer figure from Animal Farm. There's a great scene I remember where they have to fake some of the food that they had before the fall of the Berlin Wall and before they had consumer choice and so on. And she's got these sort of herrings or pickles or something that she really likes.
Yeah, Spreewaldgurken.
Yeah, but she's got a craving for them, but they don't sell them anymore. So they have to go digging in bins to try and find the old nationalised approved one. Mm-hmm. And then into the jar, they put the old jar they put nice new pickles that they've bought at the supermarket with consumer choice. And then obviously she has them and she's like, oh, these are even better than I remember. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, the blind test. I don't want to read too much into that particular movie. It is, above all, a tragic comedy. It is not meant to be political, but there is the final scene where Alec, the main actor, becomes also a narrator, and where he does say, yes, the GDR as it existed was a pretty terrible place, but the ideals continue to inspire millions of people. So there is that message. And the reason why I remember it in particular in that way is that at the time the movie came out, I actually lived in East Berlin, and there virtually everyone I spoke to saw it that way. That was the mainstream interpretation of the GDR. I did not meet a single person who glorified the GDR. It was socialist nostalgia was not a nostalgia for the GDR as it actually was, but it was this idea that it was a nice idea. They just derailed it. Yeah. It was those bad people who didn't understand it properly. They destroyed it, and as all the surveys show that is really a belief that's almost universally held. Which
is really interesting, isn't it? Because we often have a go at socialists in countries like Britain and America, who have no skin in the game, who live in a capitalist society, yet champion the benefits of socialism. But it's interesting to hear you talk of people who've actually suffered and lived under this system for some time, championing its ideological benefits.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there is the idea, people on our side of the arguments often claim that romanticizing socialism is something that only a Western hipster would do, somebody who doesn't really know much about socialism and who just jumps on the bandwagon because it's trendy to be a socialist. But that isn't the whole story. Actually, the idea being that somebody who lived under socialism would never do that, that's not true. It is just as trendy, just as fashionable among people who have very active memories of socialism.
This idea is clearly an extremely powerful and extremely compelling one. I'm interested in why do you think this idea persists as it has done? I mean, I suspect personally that some of the reason is that we free marketeers and capitalists, we tend to, when we win the argument, we do it on quite dry economic arguments. We do it on, point to a system where this has worked. But perhaps we don't give people a compelling alternative that they can emote to in quite the same way. Do you think that free marketeers have perhaps been weak when it comes to making the moral case against socialism? Not just the economic one, but the moral case.
I don't see how that could be done differently, because it is true that even though you can show with lots of graphs and data that in places that have liberalized their economies, plenty of places have seen dramatic drops in poverty, fantastic results all around the world, liberalizing economies, making massive progress in eradicating poverty and so on, raising literacy rates, life expectancy, infant mortality falling. You get great results there, but it is true that in a market system, that is not the intention of anyone in particular. It is not a conscious effort. People don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, today I want to raise GDP of the country. Today I want to make my contribution to a rising life expectancy. It just doesn't work that way. You have millions of people pursuing their own ends. It adds up to general economic progress, and including social progress, falling poverty, rising life expectancy and all that. But there is not one person who deliberately tries to do that, or a community who deliberately tries to do that. It's not a communal effort.
So as often happens in policy, you're saying that the winners are very much dispersed. The losers, so to speak, are very concentrated and well mobilised. But for the vast majority of people who benefit on a day-to-day basis, it's not something that really feeds into their thinking. They're just, as you say, going about life trying to, do the best they can for themselves.
Yeah, and another thing we have this bias of focusing too much on intentions. If you have a society which is explicitly organized around the aim of raising people's welfare, of raising living standards, eradicating poverty, and so on, there's something noble and inspiring in that. And whereas economy, where that just happens as a byproduct, doesn't grip the imagination in the same way.
Yeah.
You can see this in the case of China, where they have in recent decades, since the 80s, they've made massive improvements in cutting poverty. Extreme poverty, if you measure that as on a $3 a day basis, then in the early 1980s, virtually the whole population lived in extreme poverty, well over 90%. We only have been a small party elite that wasn't poor. Now it's less than 1/10 of the population. That has never happened on such a scale.
That's 2 billion people in total.
Yes. But if you look at the reactions of Western intellectuals, they idolized China at a time when they pursued the policies that kept the country in that dismal poverty, and that actually in many ways made it worse, namely under Maoism, when they created the worst famine ever in human history, or at least recorded history. That was the time when you had Western intellectuals flocking to China in their thousands, coming back and waxing lyrical about it, how wonderful this was. Once they had this liberalization programs, Western intellectuals just completely lost interest in it. You would maybe read an article in the financial press, someone saying, yeah, China has introduced this liberalization and it seems to work, good stuff, but nothing that would fascinate and inspire people.
Well, my theory about this is that socialists, however much we might accuse them of being sort of pie in the sky intellectuals and not living the realm of reality, I think they're always very keen to try and find a real world example of where their ideas have actually succeeded, because they know that people like you do a good job of hauling them up whenever their ideas fail, which they always do. And so I think often at the start of one of these new experiments, they tend to flock to the place to see if it's, is this the one that's finally going to work? You saw this with Venezuela in the recent years, where much of the current Labour front bench and journalists like Owen Jones and people were ferried out to Venezuela on jollies, to go and report back on what was going on and do these glowing write-ups. Now, I suspect that whenever a new communist regime emerges, a new socialist government gets in charge, there's a scramble to try and claim this one as real socialism.
Mm-hmm. That's been going on for nearly a century. I've got my book on this coming out in a few days or weeks, where I document this going back to the 1930s, when Soviet socialism was all the rage among Western intellectuals, where you had, again, thousands of people, academics, journalists, artists, traveling there, coming back and saying, this is so wonderful, they're building a new type of society there. This is going to be completely different, a completely different model of organizing society in a collaborative way, the workers running the show. Yeah, this went on for about a decade. Then the Soviet Union fell out of fashion. It became clear in the West that it was an absolute hellhole, one of the worst places on earth. Then all those thousands of people who had previously praised it fell silent on it. What's specific about that period, the 40s, when Soviet enthusiasm disappeared, was that there was no soul searching. There were very few people who asked themselves publicly, right, what did I do wrong? Why was I so deluded? They just fell silent on the subject and pretended that it never happened.
Well, actually, even in the case of Eric Hobsbawm, decades after millions of people had died in purges and in gulags and so on, he was saying that he still believed that if it had been able to produce a coherent, functioning communist society of the kind that he imagined, then all the death and bloodshed would have been worth it. And that was in the 90s that he said that. Yeah,
but at least he was brutally honest. At least he did not hide the fact that that's the way he thought at the time. The mainstream interpretation was simply that since most Western socialists had fallen silent on the Soviet Union, at some point it started to look as if Soviet socialism was just a straw man, because it was only the critics of socialism who mentioned it. And it must look that way then if you have all the critics saying, oh, look, there you have your socialism and it's horrible, whereas among the pro-socialists, nobody mentions that example. Yeah. It looks like a straw man, probably. But
it's a classic comms strategy, isn't it? If you want the story to go away, don't feed public interest by giving a quote.
But it's worked for almost a century. It then happened again in the 60s with China becoming the new utopia, Cuba to a lesser extent, Vietnam, where you had exactly the same development, about a decade of enthusiastic endorsement and then a period of silence. And then at some point, the reinterpretation retroactively, that wasn't socialism. They never really tried. That was always a fraud.
Well, actually, I've seen versions of this very recently when I've attempted to check out some of your old articles where you link to some left-wing journalists praising Venezuela. Often those links have been removed suspiciously from the website. Moving slightly into contemporary politics, because this idea has clearly taken root amongst large sections of the intellectual class and within. But I wonder if this good idea, badly done trope, we see a version of it today in the way that contemporary kind of trendy socialists are rebranding themselves. I've noticed there's a movement to try to reframe socialism as something that's much less aggressive, much less coercive. They will tend to reject the communist label. So what was once a kind of raw, let's nationalise the means of production, you're now more likely to hear quite woolly, idealistic language, but it is essentially arguing for the same thing, that talks about workers playing a greater role in the functioning of companies, but that ultimately must involve a certain amount of requisitioning of property from shareholders. And there's even the Mariana Mazzucato style view of the state being a kind of major player or investor in the economy. Do you think that these various camps I've mentioned are, they go back to what you outlined as the good idea, badly done trope?
There's a bit of a good cop, bad cop strategy. You get the more militant socialists who sound just like in the old times, and the ones who try to sugarcoat it. But ultimately what they share is that, yes, it is true that a socialist today would sound maybe less aggressive than the young Lenin would have, who would always talk about, frame everything as a class struggle, and that you have to go after capitalists. But ultimately, the idea that socialism means giving ordinary workers control, that has always been there. There was never a time when socialists said, we want to build a society where a party elite is in charge, where a technocratic elite runs the show and workers are told what to produce at gunpoint, and if they don't fulfill their quotas, they get sent to the gulag. Nobody ever said that. The rhetoric and the intention, I think, has always been that socialism cannot be imposed from the top. You have to have a class consciousness among the workers, and then at some point they will take over. Even Lenin, who came up with this idea of the party vanguard, did not imagine that this party vanguard would then permanently lead the socialist state. He thought the workers just need a bit of nudging. They need someone to explain the dynamics of class struggle to them, and maybe who kickstarts the revolution, but then the workers would ultimately take over. And that's what I'm trying to get at in this latest paper, The Mirage of Democratic Socialism, where I talk about a socialist society that gets taken over by well-meaning idealists who say we want to. It's almost as if this actor from Goodbye Lenin and his friends, as if they took over the GDR and got a chance to implement their ideas of a nice and collaborative grassroots socialism. This idea that if you just kick out the old elites, the old dour-faced party apparatchiks, then it would all work out. And then ultimately those idealists slide back pretty quickly into the old technocratic, authoritarian ways, not because they want to, they absolutely hate it, but they do it reluctantly because they realize that's the only way socialism can work.
Thank you. For more podcasts, blogs, reports and films, go to our website iea.org.uk.